Good morning, it's April 4th, 2018, and I'm with Felicia Zamora in the Samora Library at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Jean Yoon. I'm a second-year creative writing MFA student here at the university, and I'm interviewing Felicia for the Institute of Latino Studies. So thank you so much for being here with us, Felicia.
No, thank you, Jean. I'm very excited.
Me too. Yeah, your poetry has been so electrifying in a vivifying way, and not in an electric shock way. It's very it's been really heartening to read, actually, as I've prepared this interview. So I'm wondering, I guess we can just start with the beginning.
Yeah.
The beginning.
Yeah.
And I'm always curious about poets, the language, not just the literary landscape, but the primal language landscape that poets emerge out of. And so I'm curious for you, what was your early life in language like, and how did that lead you to the literary?
Oh, that's a wonderful question.
Thank
Actually,
you.
a question I've been asked before. For me, a little backstory about me is that I've actually never met my dad. And my dad was the individual who was from Mexico. And so I am biracial. My mom was from Iowa and my dad was from Mexico. And due to some circumstances, I have never met him. And so when I was young, my mother stopped speaking Spanish in the house at a very young age. And so there was a lack of language for me from one side of the culture that I didn't get to know until I was quite a bit older. And there are many reasons why we each have our own journey with language. And so then my mother also wrote these children's stories that she never had published, because it was the 70s and 80s, and it was hard during that time to get anything published, let alone a children's book. But she would write these books, and then we would take them to school, my siblings and I, and we'd have our teachers read these books. And so I was writing small mini books from a very, very young age, really emulating my mother. And I think she got me into this process of thinking about language and the necessity to get things on the page, and the necessity to have art in your life in a way that is meaningful and drawing. And so for when I came to poetry, I actually took a somewhat resistant path. I've always been writing, and I've always loved language, both in what it can achieve and its failures. Because I always think that in a lot of ways, the word itself is a failure, because it can never be the thing. It can never be it, but yet it's this lovely, intimate failure that we use to communicate every single day. And the power of that in poetry, there's this unbelievable, exquisite sparseness to poetry that requires everything be heightened, everything be paid attention to, which I'm so drawn to. But really began to skip art in high school because I thought that, I have to be able to provide for myself and for a family someday. And so it wasn't until college that I started taking all these poetry classes. Didn't even declare the minor until it was complete with the curriculum. And then it wasn't later on until I started the MFA program that I fully said, yes, I'm going to give over to this now. It's time.
So it sounds like it was, that was a beautiful wending through the kind of ever-present frequency of insufficiency that sort of both limits and animates poetry, which is an idea that I'm really drawn to, and I see in your work, and I've read other interviews where you talk at length about that idea. So I'm really curious about bookmarking that and sort of digging deeper in that trench, in that really vital trench. But so it sounds like, but poetry as an activity for you was something kind of latent that was sort of, it sounds like it was sidelined for living in the world. And I'm curious, I'm so curious about that nexus where poetry became the thing that surfaced as the way that you could be in the world. And Was that an experience of being in the right institutions? Was it a matter of relationships?
Yeah.
Like, what were the human catalysts that sort of allowed you to step into that?
That made that happen.
Yeah.
You know, I think part of it for me was that in my undergrad, and I pull a lot of my history back to undergrad, of where I was in this place that I could have these other levels of thought. Because in reality, I grew up in a very small town in Iowa, where my brother and sister and I were the first diverse family sort of in this town. And people were very kind, and we had a relationship to the individuals that we met, as well as to the town, and opportunities that we probably couldn't have had if we were someplace else.
Yeah.
But there was this otherness that was sort of always happening for us, that we always felt a little bit other, despite people being welcoming in many different ways. But we didn't get to go anywhere. We didn't get to do anything, and that was largely due to socioeconomic class. We were, I would say, in the United States, we were pretty much considered at poverty. That's all relative, you know, that's all subjective depending upon where you're at. You know, we had a place to live.
Right.
You know, we had a place to live.
Right. But
we had food.
But you can still see the gradations above and below from wherever you are. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of what comes out in my work really does speak to socioeconomic class as well, and otherness. And finding that in undergrad, that was a space where these levels of thought could start to converge, and could really start thinking about where I've come from, where I'm at, where I'm going. You know, and a lot of times people have asked me, you know, what was your journey in writing? And the reality is that when you are from severe poverty, you don't realize that you can have a journey. You don't plan that far out. You simply have all of these happenstances fall into your lap, and then all of a sudden you look back and you think, I had a journey, wow, I didn't realize that. And so for me, the undergrad experience, and having some professors there who, you know, some of my favorite courses were like African American literature, Native American literature, and women's literature, and then the poetry workshops, where I remember two poets who I had not read before. Philip Levine, whose book What Work Is was all about factory workers in Detroit. My mom worked in a factory for 13 years, and so that for me was eye-opening, that poetry can be about someone as common as me.
Yeah, right.
And then Joy Harjo's She Had Some Horses was, not only was Philip Levine showing me that there was poetry out there for the common person, then Joy Harjo was showing me that there's poetry for women of color. That women of color can have a voice, and a very powerful voice in this realm. And so it was sort of sealed at that time. From my first poetry workshop to these literature courses, I kept writing poetry. Even though there's about a 5-year gap between the time that I finished undergrad and went into the MFA program. But the deed was done. Right.
The seed was sown, the channel was opened. Yeah, I think that's so, what I hear in that story is like, I think especially for people who have like a very, and I love that there's an honesty in that, like, you know from the very beginning if you're other or not, like in any dimension, especially like growing up in white America, and that sense of otherness, like until I think for people who experience that sense of otherness, until we see like definitive markers of that, like that permission to be voiced.
Yes.
It doesn't. You're right. The possibility of imagining ourselves as like someone with the potential to become, or with who deserve a trajectory. That's really profound, and I sense. I know that also. I've reading your poems. I think there's very much like a sort of a sense of the imminent process of becoming that you're constantly wrestling with or wondering about. And I'm so curious, what is the experience, what is almost like the physical or the metaphysical experience of writing or coming to the page like for you?
Yeah, and you know, I have said before that I think about going to the page because something brings us there, and each person's journey is very different. And for me, it's always this trifecta of it's either love or it's obsession or it's need. And it's one of those things or it's all of those things, and sometimes I'm not sure. And there I am. There I am at the page. And it's important to get there because I'm not necessarily sure that there is such a thing as writer's block. What I think there is there's this hesitancy to get us to the page. And once we're there, we have to trust that we know what we're doing and trust into that process. The process is so important. There are so many aspects of the artistic process that I walk away from writing some of the poems in a Form and Gather and come to them days later, and I'm not necessarily sure that I remember writing them all. And that for me is a good thing because it means that my intention and my cleverness and all these things that I want to project into the writing aren't there. I think sometimes we get in our own way as writers because we find that if we think about it too much, we take the process away. And a mentor of mine and a good friend, Dan Beachy-Quick, he said, trust the process. He told me that all the time during the MFA, and I truly didn't know what that meant until after I had graduated. I had written a thesis, and it was a book, and I mean, it's there. It's what it is. But I think the process of writing for me happened after graduation of the MFA because you realize that you have all the components that you need to do this, to write, and to write a book, and to write many books, and to be a poet. And maybe for me, I needed that sort of validation because I felt that my journey was windy to get to poetry, let alone to get to the page. And now I look back and I just think, wow, I'd wasted time contemplating myself. But that's what we always do, right? We have to find ourselves in something. We have to find ourselves in words. We have to find ourselves in the books of people who look like us,
right?
Who are going through the same sort of things that we go through,
right? And people who are going through very radically different things, right?
Yes, and open to that experience that the poem creates on the page,
right?
And to be able to fall into someone else's experience and walk away and think, wow. On the plane here, I'm reading Danez Smith's "Don't Call Us Dead." And I was crying during Dear White America. Yeah. Because it is not my journey, and it yet is my journey in some ways. And to have someone say it so eloquently in a way that I wish I had said that. Just that unbelievable pride for what poetry can do. Right. And for the voices of people who are being, it's not brave, it's being necessary. Right. And so, I think contemplating where you are with the page and understanding that we are creators and being created at the same time. I feel that when I write, I'm revealing things to myself that sometimes I wasn't aware of. And I love that. I hope that never stops.
How's your relationship with writing, that experience of it, is that something that you've come into, like who or what fed into your writing such that just everything you're saying about stepping to the page and on a maybe pettier level, like knowing that things sort of gel after the MFA program is extremely reassuring to me. Because you're right, like I think there are experiences where like you can be going through the training and going through the gathering and learning the forms, but the final necessary click for that all to come together and coalesce into something like a voice, like a higher voice, is not something that we can sort of will necessarily. So how, I guess I thought this was going to be a question about history, but it's again just a question about your praxis. Is how when you step to the page, what do you need, if you can articulate it, to sort of make space for that to happen?
Well, Jean, you mentioned an important thing about voice, and I think I struggled to find my voice during the MFA. And I am very, I am just so intrigued and so happy for the individuals who are going through those studies and they come with voice with them.
Yeah.
And that voice could change. But for me, I think that, I was doing work. I was doing the good work of being part of that program. But it may not have been my work yet. It may not have been the work of the voice that happened after. And discovering a voice, I think, is so important. And it's not a voice of, oh, this is Felicia's voice, so therefore we read her poetry in anything she writes, and we know this is her. Right. No, it's more of a voice that allows you to take risks, a voice that allows you to be vulnerable. I think vulnerability was a very difficult thing for me in poetry to begin with. How do you write, and I still struggle with this, how do you write emotion and not hijack you, not hijack the piece? And then what does that mean? And then I start to question, the program I was in wasn't overly diverse. At times I was the only person of color in the room. At times. And I just wonder, the things that I learned were so amazing, but yet I do feel sometimes I have to unlearn some of that in order to take it in the direction that I need my writing to go, and I need the words to go. But I think programming and learning and being part of, something as intensive as an MFA program shows you how to do that. You learn in order to, I tell my students this too when I teach Intro to Creative Writing. You learn the rules intimately, so then you can appropriately break them later. Right. So you can know what you're doing and feel comfortable in, creating a book of a form that's not even a form, and then calling it a form. I had someone tell me long ago. They said, "Oh, well, you can't use semicolons in poetry." Yeah. Right. And then of course I'm a don't tell me what to do kind of person. So I'm like, let me write an entire book that uses semicolons.
I'm gonna use semicolons in my poems.
And it's that back to that risk piece, and to the vulnerability, and you get more and more comfortable in that. And you're no longer thinking of, am I writing this to impress my workshop? Or am I writing this to get this published in XYZ magazine? Now it becomes, this is an artistic piece of work on the page. Is it where it needs to be? And almost taking yourself out of it at some respect. Because it's not yours so much anymore if you're planning to put it out into the world. Right. It has to be something greater. Right. At least it feels like that for me. And I think that's important for us to think about, how we evolve. And you will see that. You will see that when work starts to come out. You will see your own evolution, and to sometimes even look at that and think, wow. But you did mention this idea of becoming. The second manuscript that I wrote. So the first one was the MFA. So it was the thesis. The second one I had started in Martha's Vineyard at a writer's residency, and it's called Quotient. And it's had some life in the world a little bit, and it's still my favorite because I'm still grappling with this idea of becoming. And I loved this metaphor of quotient because if you divide the numerator by the denominator, you get a quotient. So if you divide a person by experiences, you get this other person. So here we are always becoming and are one thing at the same time, at all times. And sort of embracing that I have no idea what will happen next, both with me and with the page, is a really comfortable place that I like to be.
How did you get there? Not everybody, I think more poets than maybe any other kind of person, but how did you develop, where did that taste for, I think it's not as superficial as a taste, but where did that hunger and that openness to that protean, to that dynamic, How did you find that?
Well, I think the secret sauce that nobody tells you is that you write. You write, and you write, and you start to realize that what's coming out on the page is varied, and it's different, and it's moments of you, and it's not
The whole.
Yeah, and then you step back and you look at what you have at the same time. But you're right. I mean, I always think about how can I be a poet if I'm not writing poetry?
Right.
And I go through, sometimes I'll finish a manuscript and I'll go through this lull where it's a couple months. I like to give myself a couple months. And then if it gets longer, I start to think about, okay, so now why am I doing this? Why am I not at the page? Because it's not writer's block. It's the not even putting myself in that position. And then I sit, and then I require myself to sit, and I require myself to write. It's not all going to be great. It's very little of it's great, actually. But you have to be okay with that, and just know that some of the things that you think are great, other people will never think are great, and some of the things that you think are not great, people will think are great. And it's fascinating. It's that subjectivity of art.
Definitely. But also there's an element in there, I hear, of when that sense of greatness or the assurance of greatness is in question, turning to this other wheel, which is the practice.
Yep.
Just the practice. And like knowing how to pull yourself out of fallow periods,
Yep.
or to when you need to push from a different place than like inspiration or whatnot.
Yeah, the other two things that I do are I read. When I'm involved in a manuscript, I read poetry, and I don't read anything else. Some people don't read poetry to write their poetry. They read fiction or creative nonfiction, or they watch documentaries. They do all sorts of things.
Yeah.
I read poetry because I find that it helps immerse me into the being that I want to be, and I want to lead a poetic life. What does that mean for me? Well, I don't know. I'm creating it. And I like this idea of being creator and created. Like for me, I have really have found that that's a place for me. And maybe that comes from also feeling other and being so comfortable in that otherness, feeling comfortable in being created at all times. And then I also, I pay attention. I think that is the one thing that we sometimes forget, because the world is so hectic. There's so many things we could be doing. There's, for you, there's probably papers to write, projects to do.
Yeah,
and,
grad school.
Right? I mean, and then in life, there's work, and there's a partner, and there's family members, and there's do you want to have a social life amongst all of this? And then you have to step back and say, yes, we have all of this, but where is the work? Because there is an emptiness for me if that work is not being paid attention to. And I feel it, and then I feel I start to drag along the land if I'm not feeding it.
I'm really increasingly, especially approaching the end of the MFA program here, where I have spent 2 years very much like monomaniacally focused on like the work with the text, realizing maybe sort of the inverse of what you're describing a little bit is that I'm realizing that the work alone means less without the fullness of like relationships and other practices and just aliveness. So kind of as a appendage to that question, I'm curious about what other practices lead you to work, or if the work is very like. I'm always curious about the relationship for poets between that space of writing and like its shoreline with other areas of their life, and what else feeds your work.
That is really great too. That's a great question, and I think for me, one of the top priorities is I have to be out into the world. And specifically in the natural.
No breakfast.
Get out
First thing,
breakfast. Yeah, I have to get out into the world,
Right.
and for me, the natural world that has other beings that are not human are important important for me, other forms of life on this planet. I just moved from Colorado to Arizona, so I'm getting used to a completely different sort of environment, which is fun and really exciting for me, because I believe that there's so much to beauty, and then there's so much to our naturalness. Because I like to, I don't know how some people would feel about this, but I think of myself as a thing, because I find that if I think of myself as a thing, I tread more gentle on the world. I have a lighter stride that allows me to think about my impacts with other humans, with other creatures,
with other things.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's more relational.
And for me, being in spaces and spheres where I am able to sit and sometimes quietly, sometimes not quietly, and observe and feel that I have that connection to the world beyond my computer screen or beyond my cell phone, or beyond the friends and family that I talk to every day. Those are connections too, but it's a connection in a different way.
Right.
I also am an avid documentary watcher, and it's because I know that there are places that I'll probably never be, but that doesn't mean that I don't want to learn about them. And so I watch documentaries sometimes when I'm trying to get some downtime. Like something where I can just watch and feel like I'm absorbing something new.
Right. Without having to sort of bushwhack your way into it, or
And then the nuances of relationships with people too. I think that is an inescapable thing for us as artists, that it will come into the work, our obsessions will emerge whether we like it or not.
Right.
And being okay with that. And letting friends and family know that I'm so sorry, but it's all fair game.
Yeah. I am a writer.
I know this is gonna happen.
It's all going into the pot.
It's all going into it's there.
But that's amazing. I mean, to put that in the pot along with like birds and along with like the land that you walk on and everything like that. And it's funny when something about the practice of watching documentaries really clicks into mind with the poems that Form and Gather to me. And as I was reading the book, I felt like I was interacting with a prism, because at one moment there's so many, I don't want to say facets, as in, because the book has an interior. It's not merely like a faceted object to be regarded, but there are different ports of entry into it, and questions. At one point, at some points, the foremost question for me is of form and of like the mechanics of the language that you're employing, and then at the next moment, it's about sort of the volatile, imminent act of speaking, and sort of calling on speaking how speaking is a form of creating, and then the staging of the sort of restaging here of nature as this independent process that one can only call like images and movements from, and the sort of not separated observation, if that makes sense. Like you're so close to nature, and then at some points we're back in a contemplation of the capacity of language to reach towards that. And I guess that brings me back towards this idea you mentioned toward the beginning of our conversation about the inadequacy of language and the failure of language. And I wonder, can you just speak more about
absolutely
what that's like?
And I think for me, and definitely within this book, there is a contemplation about how we're always twice removed. I mean, in some way, but if I look at this book from a reader's perspective, it's sharing space together. I want me as writer and poem as art and reader as observer to come together and share in a moment, because ultimately we are readers of our own work. once we've written it, now we're a reader.
Right.
We have that creator side of it as well, but now we're also a reader engaging in a completely different way with our own art. And, for me, this idea of the limits, I really needed to explore limits in this book. The limits of language, the limits of punctuation, the limits of form itself, of binding yourself to a form that kind of pops up throughout the book.
Right.
And what that does, that pressure it puts upon you to think about a word next to a word that ends a line that is speaking to the next line that speaks to the whole stanza that is part of the poem. Like all of this necessity of connection, of being next to each other. It's part of the reason I use the ampersand, is that using the symbol of connection and continuation is completely different than saying the word and. And what does that mean visually for our eyes to see two things that have a symbol connecting them? And the same thing with the semicolon. The semicolon is a continuation of. It requires for you to look behind and forward.
Right.
And one could even say historically and then futuristically. And it is a mimicry of the work that the words are doing.
Right.
On a formulaic level.
Right.
On the page.
Right.
And that was something that I didn't realize I was doing that until I had a couple. I saw these. I think there's maybe three dominant forms that sort of pop up throughout the book, and they were just from me thinking of limit and what a limit will do and what a limit can achieve. Because in a way we are limited by many things. We're limited by language. We're limited by the landscape of the page.
Absolutely. And this question of what the limit can gesture to by virtue of limiting. Yeah. And when you what you say about the semicolon and the semicolon, like the mimicry that punctuation is, but it's a dual mimicry because calling attention to what the punctuation mark does not only gestures to what the language does, but then it also replaces what the language does in a way and sort of is like the perfection of what the language can only approximate. Right. It's like calling attention to that mechanic, and that's really exciting. I definitely noticed the ampersands and the semicolons. I'm also really there's this gesture of say word, say word. Yeah, the imperative, and I guess the imperative speaks more broadly to this convergence that is happening in the you, in the second person. And I'm curious about that in the book. Like, what is the second person for you, and in this book, and in general, as a function of your voice or as an interlocutor? Like, who is that poetic you?
And I guess it comes to the question of, who do we write for? And one would say in poetry, well, you don't write for an audience in poetry. People will say that, but I mean, in a lot of ways, the you is doing a lot of work, and it comes back to that relationship of writer as creator, as page as artistic piece, and as reader as now experiencer, and then that I, creator, also become reader. And so a lot of ways, the you plays the role of, sometimes I'm speaking to me as potential reader, knowing that I will embody that after the words hit the page. And then the you is also this larger you, this collective you, this collective we, this collective us, that is on a more societal, humanistic questioning of ourselves. And then sometimes the you, you cannot get away from implication of the self when you read you.
Right.
And knowing that, when writing this book, I thought that people are either going to fall into that and feel that it's a journey they're willing to take, or they're going to resist it. and I'm okay with either expression, however that turns out. But there is this necessity to understand that we are all guests in art. We converge on the page and we have this conversation. And it's there, and we're in it, and whether or not we want to acknowledge our presence there, I think it depends on the reader, the writer, the art itself. But it really is, it's a place to gather.
I take that. We are all guests, and art is such a beautiful, graceful, as in full of grace, not as in like a thought. I really love that idea. I have so many questions about the book and about these poems, ranging from questions about what does this ampersand mean to like who is the you. But I guess I'm also interested in where did this book germinate for you? Like, I know, and I've read from reading the book and from reading previous interviews and explanations you've given about the book. I'm so you're so open about the form being something that was sort of incipient in the work as you did it.
Yeah.
Was there like a marked beginning, and how did you know the book was done?
And these are questions I think that I'm really happy to hear that MFA students are asking these things, because it shows that you're processing. You're processing your own ability to put your thesis, your book together.
Yeah, right.
You're processing that, and you're processing, will I have what's necessary to do this as a poet once you leave the institution? Right. And I want to guarantee you that you will. You will graduate. You will. And I think that when you enter into the world and you say, yes, I'm a poet, and it's definitely, I had to walk around telling people that I'm a poet. Like, I felt really, I got to a point where, I'm Felicia, I'm a poet, and then I'm an educator, and then I tell people these things about myself, but I follow with poet, because for me it is to the core of who I am. And so, oddly enough, there's a poem about, I think it's the third section, To Begin. That is the very first piece that I wrote. And that is the very first form that emerged. So To Begin. And then the poem that came next was And Wings Made of Matchsticks. The long poem at the end came, basically second. Which is then quite strange to think about how to order a manuscript, knowing that the instinct would be I wrote this second, it should come early in the book. Right. But the reality is you write and you trust that process and you step back. Typically I step back when I'm looking at 90 pages or 90 to 75 different poems, and I step back and I say, okay, wait a minute, what have I given myself? The art is a gift, and it's good to take a look before you keep writing to a point where now you're just writing, and the project could be done. And this is the way that I like to approach it. And so I look at and I lay things out and I look at them on the screen, kind of side by side, and I think, is this art saying what it needs to say? And if so, then I start compiling and I stop writing the piece.
Curious that I think it sounds like there's so it's so, not that I don't mean, it's not that your process sounds mechanical, but that there is a sort of there's a given, and that is trust in the cohesion of the meaning or the sort of conceptual binding. without a need to sort of scratch and be like, well, I like fully explained this idea, or I fully like trusting, and instead sort of relying on like a more rhythmic or felt haptic sense almost of something's completeness.
The organic formation of manuscripts thus far has been the only way that I have done things. Will I do that in the future? I don't know. And the prescription side, from like looking at the pages and stopping, for me, I feel that poets are writers who are obsessed with the minutia. We could edit ourselves into eternity. And so the way that I think about it is I give myself a year to compile a manuscript, to think deeply upon it, to research it, to write and write and write. And then after a year, I ask myself, how can I be in that headspace ever again? And if I keep writing years out, then I start to think, well, I'm actually now writing another project. I'm onto something new, and that newness for me is also very appealing, that I want to put something into the world, I want to intensely work on it, and then I want to compile it, and then it's done. Then I send it some places, and then I've started a new project months later. Because for me, I cannot sit and wait for the life of one thing, because that for me is that's not where my energy has to be.
Right.
We're creators.
It should be multiple and I mean, it's more about the flow than about the object, right? I think this is like all so, in a way it runs very counter to like what we learn in institutions about the product over the process, or the process that has to drive toward the product. And I guess that thought takes me back a little bit, because I'm always also curious about poets that come, and I think increasingly many, if not all, of like our truly great poets of the moment, like come from backgrounds that weren't socially supposed to lead to poetry. And I guess returning to this question of like your inroads or your access into poetry, and sort of I'm curious about, and as someone going through the MFA institution, what did your MFA, and you gestured to this earlier, what did your MFA teach you, leave you with? What did you have to throw away? Like, what was that? It sounds like it both honed and it both honed your sense of going towards poetry, but also was something that you had to filter through, and I'm curious about that.
I think so. It is such a great question. You have great questions.
Oh, I just what I'm curious about.
In reality, there was a lot that I learned from the MFA, and it could be because, I think when you grow up from a certain type of existence, where you feel other, but then you also, I was from a small rural area, and but then also felt kind of uncomfortable in that area at times. Education has always taught me so much, and that's why I still work in higher education, because I think it does open opportunities, because it opens minds, because it gets you to think about things in a way that you're no longer stagnant in your own thought processes. You have to acknowledge other perspectives and think about them, even if you disagree with them. And pushing the limits of the way that you think, and the way that I think, are so important to me. I hope that the more that I keep learning, which I feel right now, the more that I learn, the more I know nothing. And I love that, because I do not want to be someone who thinks I have anything figured out. That would feel really sad for me. And so in the MFA, honestly, I think I learned how to read. I learned how to engage with a text so intimately that I felt as if it was for me. That what was being shown to me in the art was there, and it was an opportunity for me to be part of that conversation. And I don't think I had ever really read that way before. I also learned to pay attention. I learned to pay attention in workshops. That criticism is so important, but at the same time, we as creators get to decide what's valuable to us.
Right.
I mean, I think all of being part of the conversation is more valuable than what people are actually saying in the workshop at times.
Right.
Because I think, you come to a traditional workshop and you come with, what are ways to improve? And that's super helpful for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I'm not part of a writer's group. I don't have people I write with. I don't rely on a workshop to help me produce work after I've graduated, because I learned what I needed to. And now I'm a writer.
You're carrying that forward.
Yeah, you're a writer in the world.
Right.
And then the other thing, and this is something that I think we all need to consider, but as a woman of color, I think about it a lot, is that are we learning to write white?
Mm-hmm.
And that's some of the things that I felt I've had to unlearn.
Yeah, I have made that's like a whole
yeah, that's a whole
day,
other topic.
Yeah.
But I was so fortunate to see Sandra Cisneros, Joy Harjo, and Rita Dove all in a 2-day event in Phoenix that my work was a part of, and the Poetry Foundation was a part of, or the Poetry Center was a part of in Tucson. And all 3 of them brought up that topic, brought up that there was this period after they left their MFA that they had to unlearn or undo some of the work that they had done, and only because they realized, like, who was I learning about? What was the power dynamic behind the language that I was reading?
Right.
And thinking about, what am I now doing?
Right.
And I think about it still, and I don't think it's something that is going to be any sort of easy answer.
Right.
But instead, who I choose to read are a lot of people of color, a lot of women, a lot of LGBTQ writers who I feel are offering the necessity of art that needs to come at this point in time in existence.
Yeah, I think that also speaks in a totally different and very, maybe still very related way about the limits of language. Like, language in itself is not only limited as a phenomenon, but as a living and breathing part of our culture, and how we learn to use language can be as much how we learn to use language can turn around and be as much of a limit, and paradoxically and conversely, nonetheless entering into language and using it poetically can be a form of pushing against that limit. Yeah. And I guess I mean, this topic of writing whiteness or unwriting the habits that you suspect, or that may not, that you're questioning where your habits are coming from. I guess I hear so much of that in this book, because there's this vein of concern about what language does, and the language is constantly curling back in on itself, like a letter born of this jaw fastens to another. Say this string of incantations we use, and say incantations in demonstration on, constantly sort of looking askance at the way that the language is making meaning as it makes meaning. And I guess I'm not driving towards a question, but... Well,
I think that goes back to voice, too, and that also goes back to giving voice to the voiceless. And, I mean, honestly, at times I feel that I fall into certain, groups of humans that don't always have a voice that is valued on a larger society. That we have this dominant narrative that has happened over history. And that dominant narrative, whether that be white, male, cisgender narrative, it has had power, and has power in creating this language. And to call language into question in our own making, I think is part of why this book And this book came very quickly. I mean, this book was written in under a year. It was one of those moments where I just couldn't stop that process and trusted that process. And what we find is that our obsessions, even if it's subtext, even if it's unconscious to us, it's there.
Well, yeah, definitely. And so in a way, I think that's what this book is doing is so profound, actually, because it's almost subterfuging that questioning and that anti-hegemonic really stands in the language into something very lyrical and something very full of wonder, and yet sort of embracing that wonder in a way that is critical without being cynical, I think is so powerful. And lastly, I feel like in many ways you've already answered this question, and you answer this question just in the work, but how does poetry change the world, and how does it continue to change your world?
For me, I fully believe that poetry is activism. I believe that art is activism, and I believe that it's a powerful mechanism for activism. And it is a way, because I see the page as that place of gathering of all these different individuals, and a place to not feel alone in a discussion as well. I think that the way that poetry becomes necessary is that we all have poetry inside of us. We all are witness to it. It's just whether or not we have decided to create with it, or to read it, or to be part of a talking about it. But because we create a world so quickly in poetry, it allows for people to jump into these moments and to really think upon what is happening, and what is happening in time while they're both engaging in the text, but also maybe even when the text was written.
Right.
And so for me, I believe that poetry is for everyone. I just think that where they enter in, had I not read Joy Harjo, or had I not read Philip Levine, would I have turned at that moment to poet? Like an abracadabra? I don't know. And why was it not sooner?
Right.
I think we did poetry sections in my high school. Right. And that was not a significant moment in time.
I had the same experience.
Yeah, right? Well, maybe because it was also Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is a genius. I acknowledge that.
Right. And retroactively, we can see that after having climbed up a little bit higher. Higher, whatnot. But I think that's so marvelous. This idea that poetry is actually an operation in time. That this idea of gathering, not just gathering voices, but gathering moments in time together, or folding them together so that we can see connections across communities and eras and ideas. And I hear that connectivity in a really vibrant way in your work, and I've really felt it in your person, actually.
Well, that is the one. I think if there is a hope that you create something artistic and you put it into the world, you hope that someone engages with it in a way that it felt meaningful to them. And so, in a way, you saying that is like the most fulfilling thing an artist could ever hear. So thank you for
the thanks is so mutual. Thank you. Yeah. And it's been so wonderful to have this conversation.
I cannot wait. I cannot wait for your art to be out to the world, so then I can be someone to support you, and then also because I think that's the way it is. The voices of tomorrow are right here, and then you will be the next book out, and then all of a sudden I can say, I know Jean.
No, I can't wait for our work to be in the world together. Yeah. And
it's so necessary. I mean, that's the thing, is everything's been done before. Everything's been written about before. But who cares? Throw that aside. No, it hasn't been written by you. It hasn't been through your lens, your voice, your experience, and the way that you create that for a reader is going to be a completely different this completely different gathering.
Thank you. Thank you so much.